She had learned, a long time ago, not to look up when the bell over the mercantile door rang. Looking up meant hoping. And hoping, in Willow Creek, always cost more than it paid back. But she looked up anyway, the day the stranger walked in with dust on his boots and nothing to say about her. Nothing at all. And something in her chest, long since gone quiet, shifted like a door easing open after years of being shut. Willow Creek sat where the wheat fields met the slow brown water, a town of 280 souls who knew each other's business better than their own. It was not a cruel town, not exactly. It only remembered too well, and forgave too little, and mistook silence for judgment more often than it should have. Willa Bennett had lived under that silence for 3 years. She kept the mercantile's books straight, measured flour and calico with steady hands, and said, "Good morning," to people who did not always say it back. She had stopped expecting them to. Jesse Calloway rode in on a Tuesday, looking for work and nothing more. He did not know her story. For the first time in 3 years, someone in Willow Creek looked at Willa Bennett and saw only a woman behind a counter. Not a scandal, not a warning, not a joke passed between neighbors. That not knowing would change everything. The bell above the mercantile door had a crack in it, so it rang flat instead of bright, a sound like something trying to be cheerful and not quite managing. Willa Bennett had heard it 400 times a week for 3 years and had stopped hoping it meant anything good. She kept her eyes on the ledger. Column of sums, careful as stitching. Flour 6 cents. Thread, 2 spools, gone to the Hargrove place on credit again, though Mrs. Hargrove hadn't paid down the account since March. "Morning, Willa." Mrs. Odell's voice came from the back room, muffled by crates. Willa answered without looking up. "Morning." Outside, the street was doing what it always did at 8 o'clock, wagons creaking past, someone's rooster still crowing an hour too late, women in bonnets stopping to talk in the shade of the awning, their voices dropping the way voices did when they noticed the mercantile window and the woman standing in it. Willa had learned to read the shape of a conversation through glass. She didn't need to hear the words anymore. She had been engaged once. Everyone in Willow Creek knew that. What most of them believed, what she had let them believe, because the truth would have cost her sister everything, was that she'd done something to drive Thomas Hale away 3 days before their wedding. Something shameful enough that even her own family wouldn't speak on it. The truth was smaller and worse. Thomas hadn't left because of anything Willa did. He'd left with her sister Grace, and Willa had stood in the church in her mother's altered wedding dress and watched the pews empty out one family at a time, and she had never once, not to a single soul, told anyone where the groom had actually gone. Grace was married to a different man now, 2 towns over, with 2 children and a husband who didn't know. Willa had made sure of that. It was the one thing she still had left to give her sister, silence, bought with her own reputation. The bell rang again, flat and cracked. She looked up out of habit more than hope. A man she didn't know stood in the doorway with the sun behind him, hat in one hand, the other resting easy on the doorframe like he wasn't in any particular hurry to be anywhere. Dust on his boots. A canvas coat gone pale at the shoulders from weather. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been outdoors so long he'd forgotten what a ceiling was for. "Morning," he said, and nothing else. No apology in his voice, no question in his. She realized, with a small unsteady feeling low in her stomach, that she had braced herself, the way she always braced, for the flicker of recognition. The pause. The little intake of breath people gave when they placed her name with her story. It hadn't come. He didn't know her. Of course he didn't. He was a stranger, dust-worn and plainly just riding through or hunting work, and Willow Creek's oldest gossip hadn't had time yet to reach him. It meant nothing. It would mean nothing by supper, once someone at the saloon or the livery got around to telling him. Still, for the length of time it took him to cross the floor and set 2 coils of rope and a tin of nails on the counter, Willa Bennett was, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, simply a woman behind a counter. "That'll be 30 cents, she said. He counted it out without hurry, laid the coins down neat as a row of stitches, and looked at her. Actually looked, the way people used to look at her before the wedding that wasn't, and said, "Obliged." Then he was gone. bell ringing flat behind him, and Willa stood there with 30 cents in her palm and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading slow through her chest, like the first thaw after a hard winter no one had told her was ending. She didn't know his name. She found, standing there in the quiet of the store, that she wanted to. By noon, half of Willow Creek knew a stranger had ridden in looking for ranch work, and by supper, most of them had an opinion about him whether they'd met him or not. Willa heard the name first from Mrs. Odell, who heard it from her husband, who'd heard it from Hosea Pike himself at the livery. Calloway, Mrs. Odell said, stacking bolts of calico with more force than the task required. Jesse Calloway. Pike's taken him on as foreman out at the Circle H. Says the man knows cattle better than most men know their own kin. Willa kept sorting the mail slots, not turning around. That's good, then. Pike's needed help since his boy went east. Mrs. Odell gave her a sideways look, the kind Willa had learned to feel without seeing. Loretta Finch already asked him where he was from. Says he didn't rightly answer. Just sat around. Maybe he doesn't care to account for himself to Loretta Finch. Mrs. Odell's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that Willa let herself feel it as one small kindness in an otherwise ordinary day. He came back to the mercantile on Thursday. Willa knew the sound of his boots on the boardwalk before she saw him, though she couldn't have said how she knew, only that she'd noticed it once, and some part of her had kept the sound filed away without her permission. Afternoon, he said, same as before, hat in hand. Afternoon, Mr. Calloway. The name came out before she'd decided to use it, and something in his face shifted, not surprise exactly, more like a man noting a small thing and setting it aside to think on later. You've got the advantage of me, he said. Don't believe I caught your name. Willa Bennett. He nodded, like the name was just a name, and asked for a length of harness leather and a paper of tobacco, and paid for both without a word wasted, and Willa found herself, against every instinct 3 years had trained into her, wishing he'd stay a moment longer. He didn't. But he came back the following week, and the week after that, always for some small thing, nails, thread for mending, a new whetstone, and always with the same easy nod, the same short exchange, the same absence of anything in his eyes that looked like judgment. It was Hosea Pike who finally said something to her directly, leaning on the counter one Saturday while his foreman loaded feed sacks onto the wagon outside. You'll have to forgive Jesse his manners, Pike said, chewing on the end of an unlit pipe. Man doesn't talk much. Lost his people young, moved around a fair bit since. I expect he's not much used to a town that stays put long enough to know him. There's nothing to forgive, Willa said. He's been nothing but decent. Pike's eyes crinkled at that, a little too knowingly for Willa's comfort. Decent's a rare thing to be grateful for, in my experience. Says something about the rest of us, doesn't it? She didn't answer that. She didn't trust herself to. Outside, through the window, she watched Jesse Calloway heave the last feed sack onto the wagon bed with an ease that spoke of years doing exactly that kind of labor, then paused to say something to a boy, Tommy Reeves, no older than 9, who'd been hovering near the wagon wheels, clearly hoping to be asked to help. Jesse handed him a sack half his size and let him carry it, slow and proud, the last few feet to the wagon, and said something that made the boy's whole face light up. It was such a small thing. Willa told herself it was a small thing. But she stood at the window a moment too long, watching a stranger be kind to a child who had nothing to do with him, and felt the same unsteady warmth she'd felt that first Tuesday, spreading slower this time, and harder to talk herself out of. That night, walking home along the creek path with the willows hanging low and silver in the last light, Willa let herself do something she hadn't done in 3 years. She let herself wonder what it might be like to be known by someone who hadn't already decided who she was. She didn't let the thought go far. She'd learned, the hard way, what came of hoping in Willow Creek. But it walked beside her anyway, quiet and unwelcome and warm, all the way to her door. Loretta Finch had a voice made for gossip, pitched just low enough to sound private, just loud enough to carry to whoever needed to hear it. Willow was arranging spools of thread near the front window when she heard her own name drift over from the fabric table, where Loretta stood with 2 other women, heads bent together like hens over feet. Told him myself, I said. You ought to know what kind of woman you're dealing with before you go doing her any favors. Willa's hands went still on the thread. 3 years now, and still not a word of apology from her, not a word of explanation, and Thomas Hale's family run clean out of town from the shame of it. Well, I heard it different, said one of the other women, Mrs. Pruitt, in a voice that wanted to sound kind and didn't quite manage it. I heard she never said a word because there wasn't a decent word to say. That's just it, Loretta said, satisfied as a cat. A woman with nothing to hide doesn't stay so quiet about it. Willa set the spool down carefully, the way she set down everything now, like the world was made of things that might shatter if handled wrong. She did not turn around. She had learned, a long time ago, that turning around only gave people the satisfaction of watching her face. She thought of Grace. Married now, 2 children, a husband who still believed the story he'd been told, that his wife's sister had driven away her own groom through some fault too shameful to name. Grace wrote twice a year, careful letters that never mentioned Thomas, never mentioned the wedding, as if enough silence might eventually undo what had happened. Willa had promised her sister that silence. She meant to keep it, even now, even here, with Loretta Finch's voice cutting soft and cruel across the store like a blade wrapped in lace. The bell rang. Willa's whole body went tight before she could stop it, an old habit, bracing for whoever might walk through the door and add their voice to the pile. It was Jesse. He didn't look toward the fabric table. He didn't look for the source of whatever conversation had gone quiet the moment he'd stepped inside, because it had gone quiet. All 3 women suddenly very interested in a bolt of blue gingham. He walked straight to the counter, the way he always did, hat in hand. Afternoon, Miss Bennett. Afternoon. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm needing a good coil of rope. Pike's fixing to move the herd up past the north fence this week. She fetched it for him, grateful for something to do with her hands. Behind her, she was aware of Loretta Finch watching them both with the particular attention of a woman filing away details for later use. Jesse paid, same as always, coins laid neat in a row. Then he paused, just for a moment, and said, quiet enough that it wasn't for the room, "You've got good handwriting on these labels. Neater than most ledgers I've seen." It was such a small thing to say. It had nothing to do with anything Loretta Finch had been whispering. But Willa felt it land somewhere just beneath her ribs, warm and unexpected, like sunlight finding a crack in a shuttered window. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and left the way he'd come, unhurried, untouched by whatever had been said before he arrived. Loretta's voice picked back up the moment the door swung shut, but quieter now, more careful, as though even she understood that something had shifted in the room and she wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Willow went back to her thread, hands steady now, and let herself hold on to those 11 words a little longer than was wise. Mrs. Odell kept the account book behind the counter in a drawer that stuck in damp weather, and it was there, on a gray Tuesday with rain threatening over the wheat fields, that Willa found the entry that shouldn't have been there. "This can't be right," she said, running her finger down the column. "The Bennett account. It's marked paid in full." Mrs. Odell didn't look up from the crate she was unpacking. "It is paid in full. I haven't paid it. I've been putting $2 toward it every month since March, same as always. It should show $11 still owing." "Well, it doesn't." Willa set the ledger down slowly. The debt was old, left over from her father's last winter, when the doctor's bills and the coal bills had outrun what little the farm brought in before he died. She had been paying it down alone for 2 years, a little at a time, because it was hers to pay whether anyone had asked her to or not. Who paid it? Mrs. Odell straightened up, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at Willow with an expression that was trying hard to seem unbothered and failing. "Man came in Saturday, while you were home sick. Paid the balance in full, cash, and asked me not to make a fuss about it." "Who?" "Jesse Calloway." The name sat in the quiet store like something dropped and not yet swept up. "He shouldn't have done that," Willa said, and her voice came out sharper than she meant it to, sharp with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite the other thing either. I told him as much, Mrs. Odell said. He said it wasn't charity. Said a debt's a debt, and he had the money sitting idle and didn't see the sense in you carrying it 2 more years when he could see it settled in an afternoon. Willa stood very still, the way she did when she didn't trust what her face might do. $11. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't nothing, either. Not to a foreman's wages. Not to a man who, as far as anyone in Willow Creek knew, had arrived with little more than a horse and a canvas coat gone thin at the shoulders. She found him 3 days later, mending a section of fence along the Circle H's north pasture, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a line of sweat at his collar despite the cool morning. He saw her coming and straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, saying nothing, waiting the way he always waited, like a man who'd learned patience was worth more than most words. You had no right, Willa said, before she decided exactly how to begin. No, he agreed. Didn't figure I did. Then why? He considered the question longer than she expected, looking off toward the fence line, the wheat beyond it moving in slow waves under the wind. My father left debts too, he said finally. Different kind. Worse kind. Took years to see them clear, and there wasn't a soul offered to help carry it. I know what it does to a person, paying down something that isn't even theirs to owe in the first place. It was my father's debt, not mine. Didn't seem to matter much to the collectors, I expect. Willa opened her mouth to argue and found there wasn't an argument left in her. He wasn't wrong. She had carried that debt like a stone in her pocket for 2 years, a small constant weight she'd stopped noticing until it was suddenly gone. I'll pay you back, she said. Every dollar. Didn't ask you to. I know you didn't. I'm telling you anyway. Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite arriving, but close enough that Willa felt it more than saw it. Suit yourself, Miss Bennet, he said, and turned back to the fence post, and Willa stood a moment longer in the wind and the wheat before she made herself walk away, carrying something lighter than $11 back toward town. Reverend Caldwell preached on mercy that Sunday, though he hadn't planned it that way. He told Willow once, months later, that the sermon had simply arrived in him that week, and he'd never known quite where such things came from. There is a particular cruelty, he said from the pulpit, his voice carrying easy over the packed pews, in deciding we know the whole of a person's heart from the worst thing we've heard about them. Christ did not ask the woman at the well for her history before he spoke to her kindly. He simply spoke. Willa sat near the back, as she always did, in the pew closest to the door, where a person could leave quickly if leaving became necessary. She kept her eyes on her hands and did not look toward the front, where Loretta Finch sat in her good bonnet, nodding along to the sermon as though it had nothing at all to do with her. She was aware, without turning her head, of exactly where Jesse Calloway was sitting, 3 rows up, on the aisle, hat in his lap. He had started coming to service 2 weeks back, quiet as he was everywhere else, standing for the hymns without singing loud enough to be noticed, and sitting through the sermon with the stillness of a man used to long hours with only his own thoughts for company. After the final hymn, the congregation spilled out into the churchyard the way it always did, forming its usual knots of conversation, its usual currents of who spoke to whom and who didn't. Willa moved toward the gate quickly, the way she'd trained herself to, before anyone could decide whether today was a day for kindness or for looking through her like glass. Miss Bennet. She stopped. Jessie had come up beside her, hat back on now, matching her pace without seeming to hurry. Mr. Calloway, mind if I walk with you? Creek paths on my way back to the Circle H anyhow. It wasn't, not really. The Circle H sat north of town, and the creek path ran east, but Willa found she didn't have it in her to point that out. I don't mind, she said. They walked without much talk at first, the willows along the creek path hanging heavy with new spring leaves, the water running quick and bright over the stones. Somewhere behind them, Willow was aware of eyes following them out of the churchyard, of the particular silence that meant people were watching and deciding what to make of what they saw. Reverend gave a fine sermon, Jessie said eventually. He does most weeks. You don't sit up front. It wasn't a question, exactly, but Willa answered it anyway. It's easier near the door. Jessie didn't ask why. She was grateful for that more than she could have said. He only nodded, slow, like a man filing something away to think on later, the same way he had that first day at the counter. They reached the fork where the path split. One way toward the Bennett house, small and weathered at the edge of town, the other way north toward the ranch, and stopped there, the creek murmuring past, a pair of doves calling somewhere in the willows. Thank you for walking with me, Willa said. Wasn't any trouble. He didn't move to leave right away. For a moment, they simply stood there, the sun warm through new leaves, neither of them quite finding the next thing to say. And Willa realized with something like wonder that the silence between them didn't feel like the silence she'd grown used to from the rest of the town, the waiting, watching kind. This silence felt easy, companionable, like a held breath that didn't need to be let out. Good day to you, Miss Bennett, he said finally, and touched his hat, and turned north. Willa watched him go a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then walked the rest of the way home alone, the warmth of the afternoon following her all the way to her door. The mending basket at the mercantile counter wasn't officially Willa's business. Mrs. Odell took in small repairs on the side, a few extra coins for a woman raising no one's expectations but her own, but it was Willa's hands that did most of the stitching, evenings after the store closed, when the light was low and the street outside had gone quiet. Jesse brought his own mending in on a Wednesday, a canvas work shirt torn clean through at the shoulder seam, the kind of tear that came from reaching too hard for a fence post or a runaway calf. Mrs. Odell said you do good work, he said, laying the shirt on the counter, a little sheepish about it in a way that didn't quite match the rest of him. I can have it done by Friday. No hurry. He paused. Truth is, I've been wearing it torn 2 weeks now. Kept meaning to bring it in. Willa turned the shirt over, examining the tear, and found herself smiling before she decided to. 2 weeks. In this weather. You'll catch your death of cold before Friday if you keep on. Didn't figure it was anybody's business but mine. It's your shoulder that'll be sorry, not your business. He laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, like it had gotten past him before he could stop it, and Willa found she liked the sound of it more than she was prepared to admit, even to herself. She sat down with the shirt that evening after the store closed, threading her needle by lamplight, and found herself noticing things she hadn't meant to notice. The shirt was patched already, more than once, careful stitching that wasn't hers. Someone had mended this shirt before, and mended it well, with the kind of attention a person only gave to something they meant to keep using a good long while. A man who patched his own clothes instead of buying new. A man who'd paid off a stranger's debt without asking to be thanked for it. A man who walked a woman home the long way around and never once asked her to explain herself. Willa didn't let herself follow that thought all the way to wherever it was heading. She'd learned, 3 years ago, exactly how far a person could fall when they let themselves hope too much about somebody's kindness. Still, her stitches that night were smaller and neater than usual, and she found herself taking longer over the work than the tear required, turning the shoulder seam this way and that under the lamplight, in no particular hurry to be finished. He came to collect it Friday evening, later than the store's usual hours, when Mrs. Odell had already gone home and Willow was alone, sweeping the floor by the light of a single lamp. Didn't mean to keep you so late, he said, seeing her there. I don't mind. He took the shirt, turned it over once in his hands, ran his thumb along the mended seam. Fine work. It was a fine tear. Not much to it. Wasn't talking about the tear. Willa looked up at that, and found him watching her with an expression she didn't have a ready name for. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and more careful than that, like a man choosing his words with the same attention she'd given his shoulder seam. Well, she said, when the silence had gone on a moment too long to be entirely comfortable, I'm glad you're pleased. I am, he said, more than the shirt accounts for. He didn't explain what he meant by that. He only nodded, the way he always did, and left 3 coins on the counter, more than the mending was worth, though Willa didn't have the heart to argue it, and stepped out into the evening, the bell ringing flat and cracked behind him. Willa stood there a long moment, the broom forgotten in her hands, feeling something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in 3 careful years, and wasn't at all sure what to do with it now that it had arrived. Loretta Finch found Jessie at the livery on a Thursday afternoon, when she'd contrived some reason to be there involving a delivery that could easily have waited, and Willa heard the whole of it later, secondhand, from Hosea Pike, who'd been mending a bridle within earshot and hadn't the good manners to pretend otherwise. "I only thought you ought to know," Loretta had said, in the voice she used for things she wanted repeated, "seeing as you're new to town and can't be expected to know everyone's history. That Bennett girl. There was a wedding that never happened. Some scandal nobody's ever gotten to the bottom of." Pike said Jesse had gone on currying his horse the whole while, not looking up, not slowing his hand. "Is that so?" he'd said. "It is." Her own groom left her standing at the church door, and to this day she's never given a decent explanation why. A man ought to be careful, is all I'm saying. Careful who he's seen walking with. And here, Pike told Willa, grinning around his pipe like the memory pleased him a great deal. Jesse had finally looked up. "Mrs. Finch," he'd said, "I've buried a father, lost a mother young, and spent the better part of 10 years working land that wasn't mine for wages that barely covered my keep. I've learned plenty about what people will say when they think it costs them nothing to say it. I've learned considerably less about minding business that isn't mine. I expect I'll go on that way." He'd gone back to the horse. Loretta, by Pike's account, had stood there a moment with her mouth still half open, then found some sudden urgent reason to be elsewhere. Willa heard the story that evening, standing in the mercantile doorway as Pike relayed it with obvious relish, and didn't know whether to laugh or to feel the old familiar tightness rise up in her chest, the bracing feeling that always came before someone decided to ask her outright what had really happened. He didn't ask. Not that evening, not the evening after, not any evening through the whole slow turning of that spring into early summer. It was Willa, in the end, who brought it up herself, on another walk along the creek path, the willows gone full and green now, the water running lower with the season. "You know what they say about me," she said, not looking at him. "Loretta's told you. Everyone's told you by now, one way or another. I've heard a version of it. And you've never asked." He was quiet a moment, watching the water move over the stones. "Figured if there was something you wanted me to know, you'd tell me yourself, in your own time. Didn't seem my place to go digging for it. That's not how most people operate." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Willa stopped walking. He stopped beside her, patient as ever, waiting without seeming to wait for anything at all. "There's more to it than what they say," she said finally. "More than I can tell you. Not because I don't trust you. Because it isn't only my story to tell." "Then don't tell it," he said, simple as that. "I never asked you to." She looked at him then, really looked, searching his face for the things she'd learned to expect from people, the curiosity dressed up as concern, the hunger for the rest of the story. She didn't find it. She found only the same steady patience he'd carried since the first Tuesday he'd walked into the mercantile with dust on his boots and nothing to say about her at all. "Thank you," she said quietly. "No need for that." They walked on together, the creek running low and easy beside them, and Willa thought, not for the first time, that whatever this was building slowly between them, it was built on something sturdier than most things in her life had ever been. Willow Creek held its summer social the first Saturday in July, on the churchyard lawn strung with paper lanterns and ringed with tables of food that every family in town had a hand in. It was, by tradition, the one evening of the year when nearly everyone came out, rich and poor, liked and unliked alike, because to stay home was its own kind of statement nobody wanted to make. Willa had not danced at a Willow Creek social in 3 years. She came anyway, because staying away drew more talk than showing up ever did, and stood near the punch table with a cup she didn't drink from, watching the fiddler tune his strings in the fading light. She saw Jesse before he saw her. He stood near the fence with Hosea Pike, hat off, sleeves rolled against the evening warmth, looking, for once, like a man who wasn't entirely sure what to do with himself in a crowd this size. He crossed the yard when the fiddler struck the first reel and stopped in front of her, and didn't say anything clever or rehearsed. He only held out his hand. "Miss Bennet, would you do me the honor?" Willow looked at his hand a long moment. She was aware of the yard around them, the particular quiet that fell over a cluster of watching women near the punch table, the way conversations thinned out and attention gathered like weather. She took his hand. They danced 2 reels and a slow waltz after, and for the length of the music, Willow forgot to watch the edges of the crowd for judgment. Jesse wasn't a graceful dancer. He counted his steps under his breath the first reel, and she caught him at it and laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't let out in the open in longer than she wanted to think about. It was during the 3rd dance, breathless and warm from the fiddle's quickening pace, that she saw the man near the refreshment table watching them both with an expression she recognized instantly and wished she didn't. Warren Hale, Thomas's cousin. He'd never much cared for Willa even before the wedding, that wasn't, and he'd cared for her considerably less since. He waited until the music ended, until Jesse had stepped back with a small courteous nod, before he moved close enough to be heard by half the yard. "Careful there, Calloway," he said, loud enough to carry. "Some women aren't worth the trouble of learning to dance with. Ask my cousin Thomas, if you can find him. Last I heard, he was still running from whatever she did to send him off." The yard went quiet the way a yard does when everyone has heard something and no one is sure yet whether to react. Willa felt her face go hot, then cold, then strangely, terribly still, the way it always went when the old shame rose up in her. Not shame for what she'd done, because she'd done nothing, but shame at being spoken of this way in front of people, at having no way to answer without breaking a promise to her sister that mattered more to her than her own name. She opened her mouth to say something. She didn't know what. Only that the silence needed filling before it swallowed her whole. But Jesse spoke first, quiet, even, without a trace of heat in it. "I don't know your cousin," he said. "Don't much care to. I know Miss Bennet dances a fine waltz and hasn't said an unkind word to me since the day we met, which is more than I can say for most folks in this yard tonight." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Something in the flatness of it, the plain, unhurried certainty, carried further than shouting would have. Warren Hale's mouth worked once, twice, and found nothing worth saying back. He turned and walked toward the far end of the yard, and the fiddler, God bless him, struck up another reel before the silence could stretch any longer, and the yard slowly, carefully, went back to being a yard full of neighbors instead of witnesses. Willa stood very still, her heart going hard against her ribs, and felt Jesse's hand come to rest, light and steady, at her elbow. "You all right?" he asked, low, just for her. She wasn't sure, not entirely. But she nodded, because it was closer to true than anything else she could have said, and let him lead her back toward the punch table, past the watching eyes, past the whispers already starting up again behind cupped hands, and found that walking beside him made the walking easier than it had ever been alone. They left the social early, before the last of the lanterns had burned down, and walked the creek path in silence for a long while, the fiddle music fading behind them into the warm dark. "I owe you an explanation," Willa said finally, when the churchyard lights were well behind them and only the moon lit the water. "Or part of one, at least. As much as I can rightly give. You don't owe me anything. I want to give it anyway." He didn't answer that, only slowed his steps to match the seriousness settling over her, and waited. "Thomas didn't leave because of anything I did," she said. "He left with my sister. 3 days before the wedding. They went east together, and I never heard a word from either of them until Grace wrote me a year later, married to another man, 2 towns over, asking me never to tell what really happened." The water moved over the stones beside them, steady and unhurried, the only sound for a long moment. "I let the town believe whatever they wanted to believe," Willow went on. "It was easier than the truth. If people thought I'd driven Thomas away, they'd talk about me and forget about Grace soon enough. If they knew the truth, it would follow her the rest of her life, follow her children, follow a marriage that's the one good thing to come out of the whole wretched business. So you took the shame that wasn't yours to take." She looked at him, startled by how plainly he'd said it, how little judgment there was in it. It seemed the only decent thing to do, she said. Jesse was quiet a moment, looking out over the dark water. I know something about carrying weight that isn't rightly yours, he said eventually. My father left debts when he died. Gambling debts, mostly, though it took me years to understand that's what they were. I had a sister, younger than me by 6 years. When the collectors came, I did what I could to keep her fed and clothed, and when I couldn't do that anymore, not both of us together, I left her with an aunt in Missouri and went west to find work, and I told myself I'd send for her once I had something worth sending for. What happened? 10 years happened, he said. I send her money every month. Half my wages, near enough. I've never gone back. Never quite found the courage to face what she must think of me, leaving her the way I did, no matter how good my reasons seemed at the time. Willow stopped walking. Does she write you? Every month. Same as I send the money. I write back short letters. Never much in them. Never the things I ought to say. What things? That I'm sorry, he said, simple and rough. That I think of her every day. That leaving her was the hardest thing I ever did, and I've spent 10 years telling myself it was necessary instead of telling her it broke something in me I've never quite managed to fix. The moon had risen higher now, silvering the willows, and Willow found herself looking at this quiet, steady man beside her and seeing, for the first time, the shape of his own private grief, carried as carefully and as silently as she carried her sister's secret. We're a fine pair, she said softly. Both of us carrying things we won't put down. Maybe, Jesse said, it's easier to carry a weight when somebody else knows it's there. Willow didn't answer that, not in words. But she reached out, in the dark, and found his hand, and he didn't pull away, and they walked the rest of the path together like that. Two people who had each, for the first time in a long while, let themselves be known. Jesse wrote the letter on a Sunday evening, alone in the small room he rented above the Circle H bunkhouse. The lamp burned low and a fresh sheet of paper spread flat on the table where he usually kept his tally books. He had written to his sister every month for 10 years. Short letters, weather, wages, the occasional mention of a good horse or a hard winter. Never the things that mattered. Never once, in all that time, the word sorry, though he had carried it in him so long it had worn a groove clean through his chest. He thought of Willow on the creek path, telling him her sister's secret with her chin up and her voice steady, choosing honesty even though it cost her something. He thought of how she'd taken his hand in the dark without flinching from what he'd told her, how she hadn't looked at him one shade differently once she knew. He picked up the pen. Dear Ellen, I have started this letter more times than I could rightly count over the years, and torn up every one before I finished it, because I never could find the courage to write what actually needed writing. I am going to try again tonight, and I mean to see it through this time, whatever it costs me. I left you in Missouri when you were 14 years old, and I was 20. I told myself then it was the only choice, that I couldn't feed us both on what work I could find, that you'd be safer and better cared for with Aunt Frances than following me from one hard job to the next. I still believe some of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth, and I think you have always known it wasn't. The whole truth is I was scared. Scared of failing you the way our father failed us both. Scared that if I kept you with me and things went wrong, I'd have to watch it happen up close instead of imagining it from 3 states away. It was easier to leave and send money than to stay and risk being the kind of disappointment I grew up under. I am sorry, Ellen. 10 years sorry. I think of you every single day, not just when the money's due to go out, and I have missed the whole of your growing up, and there is no letter long enough to make up for that. But I wanted you to have these words at least, plain and honest, instead of one more short note about weather and wages. If you would have me, I would like to come see you. Not to ask forgiveness, though I would be grateful for it. Just to see your face again and know the sister I left behind grew into whatever fine woman I expect she's become. Your brother, who should have written this letter years ago. Jesse. He sat a long while after, the lamp burning lower, reading the words over twice before he let himself fold the paper and seal it. His hands, he noticed, were not quite steady, and he sat with that unsteadiness a moment rather than pushing it away, the way he'd have done a year ago, before a woman with soot-dark hair, and steady eyes had shown him what it looked like to carry a secret honestly instead of hiding behind it. He rode into town himself the next morning to post it, rather than waiting for the mail wagon's usual Thursday run. He wanted it gone before he could talk himself out of it again. Willow was sweeping the mercantile steps when he passed, and she looked up, and something in his face must have shown, because she set the broom aside and came to the edge of the boardwalk. "You wrote her," she said. It wasn't a question. Jesse nodded. The letter already gone from his hand, already on its way east. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it honestly before he answered, the way he'd learned to do lately, instead of reaching for the first easy word. "Lighter," he said, "and terrified, both at once." Willow smiled at that, small and real. "That sounds about right," she said, for doing something honest after so long avoiding it. The reply came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon thick with the smell of cut wheat drifting in off the fields, and Willow was the one who handed it to him, because the mail came through the mercantile before it went anywhere else in Willow Creek. "Jesse," she said, and held it out, and something in her voice must have carried the weight of what it was, because he took it from her with hands that weren't quite steady, the same unsteadiness she remembered from the morning he'd told her he'd sent it. He didn't open it there in the store. He asked, quiet, whether she might walk with him, and she untied her apron and told Mrs. Odell she'd be back within the hour, and they walked together out past the edge of town to where the wheat stood tall and gold and rustling in the afternoon wind. He sat down on a fence rail there, the letter still sealed in his hand, and looked at it a long moment before he finally broke the wax. Willa stood a little apart, giving him what privacy she could while still being near enough that he wouldn't have to be alone with whatever the letter held. She watched his face as he read, watched it change, slow and careful, the way weather changes over open country, visible from a long way off if a person knew how to look. His hand came up, halfway through, and pressed hard against his mouth, and he sat like that a moment, still and silent, and Willa's heart clenched to see it, not knowing yet whether it was grief or relief working through him. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, unashamed, and his voice, when it came, was rough as gravel. "She forgave me," he said. "Not just forgave. She said she'd been waiting 10 years for me to stop apologizing with money and start apologizing with words. Said she always understood why I left, even when it hurt her, and she's been hoping every month for a letter like this one." He held the paper out, not quite offering it, more like he needed someone else to see it was real. "She's got 2 children now," he said, wonder plain in his voice. "A boy and a girl. Married a schoolteacher. Wants me to come for Christmas, meet them all, if I'm willing." Willa felt her own eyes sting, watching this quiet, guarded man come apart so gently in the gold afternoon light. 10 years of carried weight finally set down. "Are you willing?" she asked softly. Jesse looked at her, and something in his face was different now, open in a way she hadn't seen before, unguarded in a way that made her chest go tight and warm all at once. "I am," he said, "and I have you to thank for it, though I don't rightly know how to say that properly. You don't need to thank me for anything." "I do, though," he said, standing now, close enough that she could see the wet still clinging to his lashes. "You showed me what it costs to carry a secret alone, and what it might feel like to set one down instead. I've been watching you do the harder thing for weeks now, keeping your sister safe at your own expense, and it shamed me into doing the smaller, easier version of the same brave thing." "There's nothing easy about what you did," Willa said. "No," he admitted, "but it was easier with you nearby to do it for." He didn't kiss her then. It wasn't the moment for it. Not yet, both of them still raw and unsteady with feeling. But he took her hand, right there in the gold wheat light, and held it a long moment, and Willow let him, and something between them settled a little deeper into place, quiet and certain as the wheat standing tall around them. It was Loretta Finch, in the end, who put the pieces together, though not through any particular cleverness. Only the ordinary persistence of a woman who collected other people's business the way other people collected quilting squares. She had been at the post office the week Jesse's letter went out, and she remembered, with the particular clarity gossips reserve for details that might prove useful later. The return address on the envelope his sister's reply had come in. Ellen Marsh, it read, of Sedalia, Missouri. And it was Ellen Marsh's name, mentioned once too carelessly by Hosea Pike over supper at the boarding house, that finally connected in Loretta's mind to a story she'd heard years back, before Jesse Calloway had ever ridden into Willow Creek. A story about a Calloway family in Missouri, a father dead of drink and debt, and 2 children scattered by the collectors who came calling. None of it was anyone's business. It was, by any decent measure, exactly the kind of history a man had every right to keep to himself. But decency had never much troubled Loretta Finch's curiosity, and by the following Tuesday, the story had traveled from the boarding house to the fabric table to half the porches on Main Street, gaining detail and cruelty with every telling, the way such stories always did. He abandoned that sister, Willa Hurd, standing near the mercantile door where she wasn't meant to be overheard. Left her with relations and never looked back till guilt caught up with him, I expect. Man who'd leave his own blood behind isn't the sort you want getting close to decent folks in this town. Willa's stomach dropped, cold and sudden, hearing Jesse's most private shame. The thing he'd trusted her with in the dark, the thing that had cost him 10 years of silent grief to finally set right, turned into gossip fodder on a street corner. She found him that evening at the Circle H, mending fence in the long gold light, and told him what she'd heard, watching his face go still and careful the way it did when something struck deep. They don't know the whole of it, she said quickly. They don't know about the letter, or Ellen forgiving you, or any of the good that's come since. They've only got the worst piece of the story, and they're passing it round like it's the only piece there is. Jesse set down his hammer slow, and was quiet a long moment, looking out over the pasture. Wouldn't be the first time this town judged somebody on half a story, he said finally, and there was no bitterness in it, only a tired kind of understanding. I expect you know that better than most. Willa did know it. She felt the old familiar tightness rise in her chest, the bracing feeling. Except this time it wasn't only for herself. It was for him too, for the 10 years of grief he'd finally begun to heal from, now picked over by strangers who'd never once asked him a single honest question. I'm sorry, she said. This is my fault, in a way. If we hadn't been seen together so much, hadn't given Loretta reason to go digging. It's not your fault, Jessie said, firm enough that she stopped. It's not anybody's fault, but a town that's forgotten how to leave people be. I won't have you carrying that too, on top of everything else you already carry. He reached for her hand then, steady despite everything, and Willa held on, feeling the ground shift a little beneath them both, the easy warmth of the summer giving way now to something harder, something the whole town seemed determined to make them answer for. We knew this might come, she said quietly. Both our stories, out where people could pick at them. I know it, Jessie said. And I'll tell you plain, Willa Bennett. I'd rather stand here with my worst mistake laid bare in front of the whole of Willow Creek than go back to being a man nobody knew well enough to talk about. Willa looked up at him, at the steady certainty in his face, and felt something in her own chest loosen just slightly, in spite of the gossip, in spite of the trouble surely still coming. Whatever's ahead, she said, we'll meet it together. Together, he agreed, and the words sat between them, solid as the fence post at his back, a promise neither of them had spoken aloud before, and neither of them took back now. Sheriff Boone Whitley was not a man who enjoyed being pulled into town business that had nothing to do with the law, but by the second week of the gossip, 3 separate church elders had come to him separately, each with the same complaint dressed up in different words, and a man in his position could only ignore so much before it started to look like he wasn't doing his job. He found Jesse at the Circle H on a Wednesday, hat in hand, looking about as uncomfortable as Jesse had ever seen him. Not here on official business, exactly, Whitley said. More like, well, folks are talking, Jesse, about the sister you left behind, about you and Miss Bennett, walking out so regular. Some of the church boards asking whether a man with your kind of history ought to be keeping company with a woman who's already got a scandal attached to her name. Say it don't look proper. Say it reflects poor on the town. Jesse kept currying the horse in front of him, slow, even strokes, though his jaw had gone tight. "And what do you think, Sheriff?" Whitley shifted his weight, plainly wishing he were anywhere else. "I think a man's entitled to his own history, and a woman's entitled to hers, and neither one's business of mine, so long as no laws are broken. But I've also got a county to keep peaceable, and there's talk of the church board asking Pike to let you go, if you don't put some distance between yourself and Miss Bennett. Talk of asking the Bennett girl to find work elsewhere too, if it comes to that." The currying stopped. "They can't do that," Jesse said, quiet and hard. "They can make life difficult enough that it amounts to the same thing," Whitley said. "You know how a small town works, same as I do. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's what's coming, unless something changes." Jesse set the brush down and looked out over the pasture a long moment. The wheat gone gold-brown now with the turning season, the same fields he'd walked with Willow the day his sister's letter arrived. "I won't put distance between us," he said finally. "Not for the church board. Not for this whole town, if it comes to that." Whitley sighed, long and tired. "Didn't figure you would. Just wanted you to know what's coming, so it doesn't catch you unprepared." He touched his hat and turned to go, then paused, looking back with something that might have been sympathy, or might have just been a tired man's honesty. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've known Willa Bennett her whole life. Never once seen her do a dishonest thing, or a cruel one. Whatever happened with that Hale business, I never believed the worst of it, not really. Man in my position learns to smell a story that don't quite add up." He left Jesse standing there in the gathering dusk, the weight of the coming trouble settling slow and heavy over him, and it was a long while before he found the will to go back inside. Willa heard her own version of the warning 2 days later, from Mrs. Odell, who delivered it with more gentleness than Whitley had managed, but no less plainly. "Mrs. Halloway come by this morning," Mrs. Odell said, not quite meeting Willa's eyes. "Church board's talking about whether it's fitting, you keeping this position, given the talk going round about you and Mr. Calloway both." Willa's hands went still over the ledger. "They want me gone." Mrs. Odell didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. "I won't let that happen," Mrs. Odell said finally, firm. "I've had you 3 years and never had cause for a single complaint about your work. Whatever the board decides they want to fuss about, it won't be through me putting you out. But it might come to more than you deciding," Willa said quietly. "It might come to the whole town deciding, the way it decided about me once before." Mrs. Odell reached over and took her hand, an unexpected gesture from a woman who wasn't given to such things. "Then we'll see what the whole town decides," she said. "But I'll tell you this, Willa Bennett. I've watched this town do you wrong for 3 years over a story that never made a lick of sense to me, and I'll not stand quiet and watch it happen twice." Willa held on to that small kindness as tightly as she could, because she suspected, with a cold certainty settling low in her stomach, that harder days than this one were still coming. The church board met on a Sunday evening, in the small meeting room behind the sanctuary where such matters were always decided, and though Willa was not invited to attend, she heard every detail of it before the week was out. The way news always traveled fastest through the very people who claimed to disapprove of gossip. Reverend Caldwell, by every account, had argued longest and hardest against any action at all. "We are not in the business of punishing people for the sins of their relations," he was reported to have said, "nor for scandals that were never proven, nor for choosing to keep company with whomever their own conscience allows. If we start down that road, there is no family in this town whose history could survive the same scrutiny." But the board had elders beyond the Reverend's reach, men and women who remembered the wedding that wasn't and had never once questioned the story they'd been told. And in the end, a compromise was struck that satisfied no one entirely and wounded everyone involved. Willow would keep her position at the Mercantile. Mrs. Odell had made plain she wouldn't hear otherwise, but the board voted, narrowly, to ask Hosea Pike to reconsider Jesse's standing as foreman, on the grounds that a man of unclear character oughtn't hold a position of trust and respect in the community. Pike came to Jesse himself with the news, hat in his hands, looking older than Jesse had ever seen him. "I told them where they could put their vote," Pike said. Told them I'd sooner shutter the Circle H than let a pack of church elders tell me who I can hire. But I wanted you to hear it from me plain, so you're not caught by surprise when the talk reaches you elsewhere. There's some in this town mean to make your life difficult, son, and I'm sorry for it. Because you've been the best hand I've had in 15 years, and I'll not pretend otherwise. Jesse thanked him, quiet and steady, though something in his chest had gone tight and cold hearing it laid out so plainly. Not fear for himself, exactly, but a slow dawning understanding of what his presence in Willow Creek was costing the people around him. Pike's standing with the church board, Mrs. Odell's peace with the elders, and Willa, always Willa, caught in the middle of a storm that had gathered around her 3 years before he'd ever ridden into town. He found her that evening at the creek path, waiting for him without having said she would, the way she'd started doing most evenings now. And he told her everything Pike had said, watching her face carefully as he did. "This is what I was afraid of," she said quietly, when he'd finished. "Not for myself. I've carried this town's disapproval 3 years now, and it hasn't broken me yet. But you came here with nothing, Jesse. Built something honest for yourself, and I'm the reason it's being taken apart." "You're not the reason," he said. "The reason is a town that can't leave 2 honest people be." Willa shook her head, and there was something in her face now that frightened him more than the church board ever could, a kind of resolve settling in, hard and final. "Maybe it would be easier," she said slowly, if we stopped being seen together so much. Gave them nothing more to talk about. You could keep your position. Pike wouldn't have to fight the board. It would all just quiet down in time." "Don't," Jesse said, sharper than he meant to. "I'm only saying." "I know what you're saying." She said it before, offering to pay him back for $11 he'd never wanted returned. And now here she was, offering to pay a debt she didn't owe with the one thing he'd come to want more than anything else in this world. "I've spent 10 years running from hard things," he said, "leaving my sister because staying felt too costly. I'm done running, Willa. I'm done letting other people's fear decide what I hold on to and what I let go. But this isn't only your cost to bear," she said, and her voice broke, just slightly, on the last word. "Then let me bear it anyway," he said, and reached for her hand in the fading light, and she let him take it, though the trouble between them, unspoken now, hung heavier than it had before. Willa did not sleep well that night, or the one after, turning the church board's decision over and over in her mind until it wore a groove as deep and familiar as the old shame she'd carried 3 years already. She thought of Grace, married and settled 2 towns over, protected all this time by Willa's silence. She thought of Jesse, 10 years carrying his own guilt, finally set free of it, only to have this town turn on him now for daring to care for her. She thought of Pike, an old man fighting a church board at an age when he ought to have been left in peace, and of Mrs. Odell, risking her own standing to keep Willow on. Everyone around her was paying a price for loving her, or for simply refusing to condemn her, and Willa had spent 3 years learning exactly how heavy a price this town could exact from people who didn't deserve to pay it. She made her decision before dawn, in the gray hour when the wheat fields outside her window were still more shadow than gold, and she did not let herself reconsider it once made, for fear she'd lose the nerve. She went to the Circle H herself, before the day's work had properly begun, and found Jesse at the corral, checking a mare's shoe with the same careful attention he gave everything. "I've been thinking," she said, and something in her voice must have warned him, because he straightened slowly, his face going still and watchful. "Willa, let me finish," she said, because if she didn't say it now, all at once, she wasn't certain she'd manage it at all. "I can't watch this town take apart everything you've built here. I can't watch Pike lose standing, or Mrs. Odell risk her own position, or you lose the one place that's ever felt like yours to keep, all because of me. I won't be the reason for it." "So you mean to what?" "Exactly," Jesse said, quiet and dangerous in a way she'd never heard from him before. "Send me off? Tell me to forget these past months ever happened?" "I mean to stop seeing you," she said, and the words cost her more than she'd expected, tearing loose from somewhere deep and tender. "Stop walking the creek path with you. Stop letting the whole town watch us together and decide what to make of it. If there's nothing left for them to talk about, the talk will die down in time. You'll keep your position. This will all just pass. Jesse set down the mare's hoof, slow and deliberate, and crossed the yard to stand in front of her, close enough that she had to tip her head back to meet his eyes. You think I care more for a foreman's wages than I care for you, he said, and it wasn't a question. I think you shouldn't have to choose, she said, her voice unsteady now. And if you won't choose for yourself, I'll choose for both of us. That's not your choice to make, Willow. It's the only choice I've got left, she said. Everything else has already been taken from me. My name, my story, 3 years of this town deciding who I am before I ever get to say it myself. This is the one thing I can still choose. To stop the bleeding before it costs you everything too. She turned to go before he could answer, before the tears building hot behind her eyes could fall where he'd see them, and walked back toward town with her arms wrapped tight around herself, feeling each step as though it cost her something essential, some small piece of herself given up to spare the people she'd come to love from a town that had never once learned how to be gentle with the people in its keeping. Behind her, she heard Jesse call her name once, and then nothing more, and she did not trust herself to turn around and see whether he'd let her go, or whether something in his face might undo the whole of her resolve. Tobias Vance had worked the Circle H longer than any hand still living, older even than Pike himself, and he found Jesse 3 days later sitting alone on the fence rail at dusk, not working, not resting, just sitting with his hat pushed back and his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. You've had the look of a kicked dog 3 days running, Vance said, settling onto the rail beside him without waiting for an invitation. Figure it's got something to do with why Willa Bennett hasn't walked past this ranch on her way anywhere in nearly a week. Jesse didn't answer right away. Out past the fence, the wheat had gone the deep gold of late summer, rustling soft in the evening wind, and he found himself thinking of the letter he'd almost never sent, the 10 years he'd spent telling himself silence was safer than the truth. She's trying to protect me, he said finally. Thinks if she stops being seen with me, the town will leave off, and I'll keep my place here, and everybody's troubles will just quiet down in time. Will they? Vance asked. Quiet down, I mean. Jesse thought about that a long moment. No, he admitted. I don't expect they will. Not really. She'll go on being the woman this town decided to mistrust 3 years back, same as before, only now she'll be doing it alone again, and I'll be sitting out here every evening wondering what I'm even staying for. Then why in God's name are you sitting on this fence instead of telling her that? Because she thinks it's the noble thing, Jesse said. Sacrificing what she wants so the people around her don't have to pay for it. And I understand that, Tobe. I understand it better than most, because I did the same fool thing to my own sister for 10 years, and I told myself the whole time it was love making the choice, when really it was fear wearing love's clothes. Vance was quiet a moment, working a piece of straw between his teeth, watching the last light fade gold and orange over the pasture. You know what I think, he said eventually. I think you've spent your whole life letting other people's fear decide things for you. Your father's debts decided you had to leave your sister. This town's gossip near decided you'd let Willow walk away without a fight. Seems to me a man could spend his whole life letting other people's fear write the story of his life, if he's not careful, and wake up one day an old fool like me, wondering where all the years went and why he never once fought for the thing that mattered. Jesse looked over at him, something shifting slow and certain in his chest. That a fact, Tobe? That's a fact, Vance said, standing now, dusting off his trousers. Now get off this fence and go tell that woman what you actually want, before fear finishes writing this story for the both of you. Jesse sat a moment longer, watching the last of the light drain out of the sky, feeling 10 years of old habit. Leaving quiet, letting go easy, telling himself distance was safer than risk, finally loosened its grip on him. Then he stood and reached for his hat and walked toward the stable to saddle his horse, the wheat rustling gold and endless all around him, carrying him toward whatever waited at the end of the creek path. Willow was closing the mercantile alone when she heard the bell ring, flat and cracked as it always was, and looked up expecting Mrs. Odell returning for something forgotten. It was Jesse, dust on his boots from the ride, his hat gone crooked from the wind, standing in the doorway with an urgency in his face she'd never seen there before. "We're closed," she started to say, out of habit more than anything, and then stopped, because his eyes weren't asking about the store hours at all. "I let you walk away 3 days ago," he said, crossing the floor toward her without waiting to be invited closer. "Told myself it was because I respected your choice, respected what you were trying to do for me. But that was a lie I told myself, Willa. The truth is I've spent 10 years letting fear make my choices, and when you turned and walked off that morning, some old, tired part of me just let you go, the same way I let my sister go, because it was easier than fighting for what I actually wanted." Willa's hands had gone still at her sides, her heart beating hard and uneven. "Jesse, let me finish," he said, echoing her own words back to her from days before, and something in that small mirroring nearly undid her right there. "I don't care what the church board decides. I don't care if Pike loses every hand he's got fighting them, though I expect he won't, stubborn as he is. I don't care if this whole town spends the rest of its days finding new things to whisper about us. I have spent my whole life running from the hard, costly thing, telling myself it was wisdom when it was only ever fear. I am done running, Willa Bennett. I want you, not the quiet, careful version of you that keeps to the edges and never gives this town more to talk about. All of you, whatever it costs." Willa felt the tears come before she could stop them, hot and sudden, 3 years of careful bracing finally cracking open all at once. "It might cost you everything," she said, her voice breaking. "This place, Pike's respect. You're standing in this town. Then it costs me everything," he said, closing the last distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face, gentle as anything she'd ever known. "I'd rather have nothing in this town and you beside me than everything in it and you gone." She didn't have words left for an answer. She only reached up, caught his hands in hers, and let herself, for the first time in 3 long, careful years, stop bracing for the worst and simply lean into something good. He kissed her there in the near dark of the closed mercantile, gentle and certain, the bell above the door hanging silent and still, and neither of them heard the small sound of footsteps stopping just outside on the boardwalk. Tommy Reeves, sent by his mother to fetch a forgotten spool of thread, standing frozen at the window with his mouth open, before he turned and ran the whole way home to tell absolutely everyone what he'd seen. By the time the church board convened its next meeting, called special session on a Wednesday evening at Reverend Caldwell's insistence, half the town already knew what Tommy Reeves had seen through the mercantile window, and the other half had heard some embellished version of it by supper time. Willa did not attend, nor was she asked to. But Jesse did, uninvited, standing at the back of the meeting room with his hat in his hands while the elders argued in low, urgent voices at the front, and it was Reverend Caldwell, finally, who turned the tide of the room in a way none of them expected. "I have sat in this room and listened to good people speak of character and propriety for 2 evenings running," he said, his voice carrying with a weight it rarely held from the pulpit. "And in all that talk, I have not once heard a single soul mention that Jesse Calloway paid off a widow's debt without being asked, or that he has sent half his wages to a sister he wronged and has now made honest amends with, or that he stood in a churchyard this summer and defended a woman's honor when not one of us had the courage to do the same. I have not heard anyone mention that Willa Bennett has quietly forgiven every debt owed to this store by families too proud to admit their need for 3 years running, without once asking for thanks. We are very good," he went on, quieter now, "at remembering the worst thing we ever heard about a person. We are considerably worse at remembering the good we've watched them do with our own eyes, when it doesn't fit the story we already decided to believe." The room was silent a long moment. Somewhere near the front, Willa learned later, Hosea Pike had stood, slow and deliberate, his old joints protesting the effort. "I'll say plain what I should have said from the start," Pike said. "Jesse Calloway is the finest hand I've had in 15 years, and if this board means to force my hand on who I employ, I'll close the Circle H before I let strangers dictate who's fit to work my land. And I'll say this too. I've watched this town do Willa Bennett a grave wrong for 3 years running, over a story not one of us ever bothered to ask her about honestly. I, for one, am tired of it. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. Some wounds in a small town never fully close, and Willow would learn in the months ahead that a few doors would remain quietly shut to her regardless of anything said that evening. But the board's demand was withdrawn, and Jesse kept his position, and word of Reverend Caldwell's speech traveled through Willow Creek in the days after with considerably more warmth than Loretta Finch's gossip ever had. It was Grace, of all people, who finally broke the last of it open, arriving unannounced on the Thursday stage with her husband and both children in tow, having heard through a cousin's letter that her sister's whole life had come under scrutiny once more. "I should have told the truth 3 years ago," Grace said, standing in Willa's small kitchen with her hands twisted together, her husband waiting uncertain in the doorway. Already told, on the ride over, everything Grace had kept from him so long. "I let you carry it alone because it was easier, and I have hated myself for it every single day since, and I am done letting you pay for my mistake." Willa, weeping now in a way she hadn't allowed herself in 3 long years, reached for her sister's hands, and found, for the first time since the wedding that the weight she'd carried so carefully and so long had finally, gently, been set down. The truth, once Grace finally spoke it plainly to anyone who'd listen, moved through Willow Creek the way truth always did when it finally arrived, slower than gossip, but sturdier, settling into the town's memory in a way the old rumors never quite had. Willa did not need it to change anything, not really. She had made her peace, in her own private way, with carrying her sister's secret long before Grace ever arrived to lift it from her shoulders. But she would not pretend it didn't matter, watching Loretta Finch's face go carefully blank the first time they passed on the boardwalk, watching Mrs. Pruitt stop her outside the church one Sunday to say, stiff and awkward but plainly meant, that she was sorry for believing the worst of her so easily. It didn't undo 3 years. Nothing could do that, but it let her walk through Willow Creek, at last, without the old bracing tightness in her chest, and that alone felt like more freedom than she'd known to hope for. Jesse found her on the creek path on a crisp October evening, the willows gone gold and thinning now with the turning season, and he didn't say anything at first, only fell into step beside her the way he had that very first Sunday, patient and unhurried. "I had a letter from Ellen," he said eventually. "She's asked us both to come for Christmas. Says she won't take no for an answer, and knowing her these past months, I believe she means it." "Both of us," Willow repeated, something warm rising in her chest. "Both of us," he confirmed. "If you'll have me, Willa Bennett, I don't aim to walk into my sister's home introducing you as anything less than what I hope you'll agree to be." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her, and there, in the fading gold light with the creek running low and easy over the stones, he knelt on the worn path and took her hand in both of his. "I've spent 10 years running from the hard, costly things," he said, his voice steady despite the unsteadiness in his eyes. "I'm done running. I want to build something here, in this town, with you, not despite everything it's cost us, but because I've never once regretted a single hour I've spent loving you, hard as this town has made it. Marry me, Willa. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to brace yourself again." Willa looked down at him, at this quiet, steady man who had walked into her life on an ordinary Tuesday with dust on his boots and nothing to say about her at all, and found, for the first time in 3 long, careful years, that she had absolutely no instinct left to guard herself against. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and certain, carrying all the way down the creek path and out over the gold, thinning willows. "Yes, Jessie Calloway. 1,000 times yes." He stood and kissed her there in the fading light, and this time there was no window between them and the world, no boardwalk witness to run off with the news. There was only the creek and the willows and the wide golden sky, holding quiet witness to 2 people who had finally, after everything, stopped running from the thing they wanted most. They married in December, in the same small church where the Sermon on Mercy had first settled its quiet weight over Willow 3 years' worth of Sundays before. And though it was not the wedding either of them might once have imagined, it was, by every measure that mattered, the one either of them had actually wanted. Grace stood beside her sister at the front of the church, weeping openly through the whole ceremony in a way that made Willow laugh even as her own eyes filled. Ellen had come all the way from Missouri with her husband and both children, and sat in the second pew beside Hosea Pike, who wore his one good suit and dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief he pretended, unconvincingly, was only there for his allergies. Mrs. Odell had closed the mercantile for the day, the first time in memory she'd done so for anything short of a death in the family, and sat near the back with an expression of fierce, proprietary pride, as though she'd had a hand in the whole courtship herself, which, in her own quiet way, she rather had. Even Loretta Finch attended, seated near the rear, her face carrying something that might, in the right light, have passed for shame, and though Willa did not forgive easily, and did not pretend the old wounds had vanished entirely, she found, watching Loretta's hesitant nod from across the aisle, that she no longer needed to carry any bitterness about it either. Some things, she was learning, simply got to be set down and left behind, whether or not the person who caused them ever fully understood what they'd cost. Reverend Caldwell spoke briefly before the vows, his voice carrying the same weight it had that summer evening in the church board's back room. This town, he said, looking out over the gathered congregation, has not always been gentle with the people in its keeping. I include myself in that failing more often than I'd like to admit. But here, today, we have the chance to witness what happens when two people refuse to let a town's fear write the whole of their story. I hope we all leave here today a little braver about the stories we choose to believe and a little slower to believe the worst of our neighbors. Willa, standing at the altar in a simple blue dress with her sister's hand resting warm on her shoulder, found she could not have asked for a truer blessing. Afterward, the whole town gathered on the churchyard lawn, the same lawn strung with lanterns each July, now dusted with the season's first light snow, and there was dancing again, warmer and easier than that summer night had been, Jesse counting his steps under his breath just as badly as before, and Willow laughing at him just as freely. Tommy Reeves, grown an inch taller since the summer and considerably prouder of his role in the whole affair, told anyone who'd listened that he'd been the very first to know, on account of the window, and nobody had the heart to tell him to hush. Willa stood at the edge of the lawn as evening settled soft and blue over Willow Creek, watching the lanterns flicker to life one by one, watching Jesse move through the crowd of neighbors who had, in their own slow and imperfect way, finally learned to see him, and her, for who they actually were, rather than the stories once told about them. She thought of the cracked bell above the mercantile door, ringing flat all those years, and how she'd stopped hoping, once, that its sound might ever mean something good. She did not stop hoping anymore. Jesse found her there at the edge of the lawn, and took her hand without a word, and together they walked back into the warmth and the lantern light, two people who had changed a town simply by refusing to let it decide, ahead of time, who they were allowed to become. If stories of courage, kindness, and second chances speak to your heart, we would be honored to have you join us for the next journey. Thank you for walking this road with Willa and Jesse, and with the town of Willow Creek. We will see you next time.